started this afternoon. I realized after the talk that I gave you on Africa and American relations that it was all rather bleak. And that's not the case at all. There are many great things that went on. And I want to tell you particularly about one that I always loved going back to Africa, but not to South Africa so much, but to Botswana. And the reason I like Botswana best is because there are more animals there than there are people. And also there was a man who moved from what was called Rhodesia because he didn't like the way the government was going, and he moved to Botswana. And he ended up writing a series of novels. And they're called the #1 Detective Agency. And his woman is in the title, the #1 Woman Detective. And so he created this woman, this African woman, and she was kind of the heroine of his series of books, and they become bestsellers. And people in the United States were reading them. There are 10 in the series. And yes?
Could we hear it a little louder, please? In trouble.
Yeah, you can't hear me. Can you hear me better now?
Yes,
Okay.
that's better. Thank you.
I'll swallow this microphone. This was called the #1 Woman Detective Agency in Botswana. And the guy was Scottish. And he lived on in Africa for his whole life. So it was a pleasant life as far as he was concerned. And he went back to Edinburgh every year. And then he wrote a series of detective novels about a Scottish woman in Edinburgh. So you have the series on both sides to tell you a story that in Africa, there are many great success stories of whites and blacks together. Now, as usual, things aren't perfect, so that when Mandela had to step down, he was ill and then he died, the Nationalist Party was not, in fact, handed over to a good person, and so they've had troubles ever since. And that's the story sometimes in the North and in the South and in the middle. Certainly you must have heard during your lifetime about an uprising led by the Mau Mau, who were in Kenya. And their purpose was to kill white people. So that's hardly what you'd call a blessing for Africa and its peaceful settlement. So there have been upsides and downsides, but much of it has been the upside of good people working together and building a country or building a continent for which they were very, very glad to be a part of. But we're not going to talk anymore about Africa today. We're going to talk about South America today. And the relationship we've had with South America has been one of benign neglect, if you remember that term at all. And we called it the good neighbor policy, but nobody had any thought that we were the good neighbor. And so we got tired of trying to sell that, so we tried to sell an alliance for progress, but that didn't work either. So we're going to have some bouncy times when we go through our relationship with the South Americans. What to start with? Well, there are 3 great nations in South America that are not part of our experience at all. They're often referred to as the ABC countries: Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. And Chile is one of the perfect examples of where things go wrong. We once had a president by the name of Richard Milhous Nixon. Surely you must remember him. And he and his German foreign minister, you want to sit down? Henry Kissinger decided that there was trouble coming our way. What would that trouble be? Well, there's a very large company in Chile that's owned by the Americans. It's called Anaconda. It's Anaconda Copper. And it was very productive. And we paid a small pittance to the Chileans. And suddenly it looked like the Chilean government would nationalize this company. Now, Chile was run in those days by Salvador Allende. You might have heard the name because his niece is a famous writer here in California. And so it was that rather than let things go bad, we organized a coup. And this coup d'etat led to the overthrow of Allende. And in the overthrow, obviously, Allende fought back with his forces and he was killed. And we saw to it that the new government was formed that we were pleased with. A government run by General Pinochet. And Pinochet was nothing but a military dictator. He was in the military in Chile and now became the head of state. We got our comeuppance though because the Chileans did not give up. That is, those who wanted freedom. And so one time when Pinochet thought all was well, he went traveling to Britain, to London. The British have a great number of Chileans who have dual citizenship. So it's easy enough for them to go back and forth between Chile and London. And in this process, a very, very influential man sued to have Pinochet arrested. And he sued in the strangest court, in a Spanish court, and the Spanish judge held in his favor. So here you had Pinochet, the dictator of Chile, that we had installed, by the way. And you have him being arrested now because this judge issued this warrant, and it was issued in the European system, which meant London had to listen to it. And so finally we were able to get rid of Pinochet. It was a very torturous example of how not to involve yourself in the political extremes of South America. And by the way, Anaconda was finally nationalized by the Chileans, even though to Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, this looked like creeping socialism. And it remained a great asset of the Chilean people. It's one of the things that makes money for them instead of losing money. And at the same time, there was a very famous woman who lives here with us, not in Piedmont Gardens, but in Northern California. Her name is Isabel Allende. She's a very famous writer. And her first book was actually made into an example of a new style of writing that had been created outside of the European American way of thinking. The great invention of the 20th century for writers was what the great Irishman James Joyce did with a book called Ulysses. It's a type of stream of consciousness writing. Well, now the South Americans are inventing a whole new way of writing, and it was called magical realism. And Isabel wrote her first book in that tradition. It became a rather famous film, made with a lot of very poor Hollywood actors, starting actually with Meryl Streep, who did a terrible, terrible job. But what this was an example of, I'll give you a great book in this tradition. It's called 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And in this case, he makes an argument. There are many, many villages and towns in and around South America that are left behind. That is, they never got part of the modern world. And so they live with a kind of mysticism, and they can believe in traditional Indian lore. So the tables levitate, they move under mysterious powers, and it seems to them to be quite real. So Gabriel Marquez wrote two great novels, both turned into films. The better one for films is Javier Bardem's Love in the Time of the Cholera. And this kind of thinking, this way of writing, became a hallmark of the South American novel. And it passed on into history today. There are people who write in the tradition of magical realism. And there are some who enjoy that and others who don't. But it has made a tremendous impression on Western lit. So it was that Isabel, living up here in Northern California, dropped it as a way of writing because it didn't represent California. You don't see people talking about how that chair rose up and went out the door. Thank heavens we don't think that way. And so therefore, she found a more modest way of writing. Isabel actually writes in Spanish and has a very good translate her novels for her. And she has gone on to write around 20 of these extremely good and influential pieces, many of which are in our library here. And soon, I hope, when we're fully open and we can have outsiders, I hope to have her over to give you a lecture involving her most recent book, because she's still producing great pieces of literature for the Americans, particularly now that she can interact fully with us and see us as we are. She can then put it down on paper. So between her and the other guy I just mentioned, we have a whole flood of people writing in a tradition that is from the South American experience. Now, when I told you the story about how we staged a coup that overthrew Allende, and now we've not learned our lesson. The Kennedy brothers overthrew the Diem machine in Vietnam, ending in the murder of the 2 leaders of Vietnam and the takeover by the military, and then the loss of the war by us. You know, we did lose the Vietnam War. That's not a secret. So again, we lost out in the fight with the Chileans. Now, there were other problems in South America at the same time. These ABC countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, all have different experiences. The Brazilians do not speak Spanish. They speak Portuguese, a nearby related Romance language, but nevertheless different than Spanish. And their settlement process was very different. When the Portuguese came to Brazil, they brought very few women with them. So you have these Portuguese settlers, all male. So they married into the slave population that was there because there was a great deal of slavery in Brazil. So modern Brazilians today are a multiracial group with a mix of both black and white blood and producing a very beautiful stock of people and living in great wealth in some cases and in great poverty in other cases. Their big cities are places like Rio de Janeiro. They decided that Rio was a playland for Americans, and so they built a new capital at Brasilia from scratch, very much like our capital was built, Washington, D.C., from scratch. You do know that Washington didn't exist, right, when we were colonies, and that it was built also by a Frenchman, not by an American. That's why all those devilish circles exist in Washington, because the French love big turnarounds and circles, and so they put them all over Washington. Now, many Americans who go to Washington have a hard time finding their way around the Lincoln Memorial and other places because they're surrounded in circles. So Brasilia was built, and Brazil also has another unique problem. I know when you see me go like this, I'm breathing because my lungs require oxygen. And I don't know if you know it, but there are great lungs located in historic geographic places. Amazonia, the great Amazon basin, is one of the globe's great lungs. The other great lungs are in Southeast Asia, where all those huge forests, which are now being cut down, just like the forests of Amazonia. And that's leading to the loss of a great deal of timberland, and it's being burnt down because people want to move in there and farm it. But it's a disaster. So what the United Nations and most of the West, particularly in North America, have decided to do is to pay the Brazilians not to burn down, not to cut down, not to misuse the forest of Amazonia, so that it can act again as the lungs that are very necessary for the globe to be able to breathe. With warming of the climate and other problems, it's a very difficult time to think about what to do with these particular problems. But at the same time, the Brazilians, the Argentinians, and the Chileans all have their unique history. The Argentinians have a very difficult history because they early in life had a dictator, actually not one that we found for them. And his name was Juan Perón. He was a military man. And he had a dreadful wife, Evita, who became the star of the London and then a Broadway play. That famous song, Don't Cry for Me, Argentina. So Evita Perón, who was basically a prostitute, and Juan Perón ran the country. And you must not understand that everyone who wanted to leave Europe wanted to come to the United States. They didn't. There are more Germans in Buenos Aires than there are in New York City or in New York State. Thousands upon thousands of Germans settled in the area around Buenos Aires and towards the north. And they helped build Argentina into a great country, but unfortunately, it became a nest for Nazis. And you might have heard the famous story, the infamous story of the search for certain Nazis who, when they fled Germany at the end of the war, they went to Argentina because they felt they had compatriots there. And American movies showed that to be true. Hitchcock made a very famous movie with Gary Cooper, Gregory, who was it? Ingrid Bergman and Cary Grant. The film was called Notorious. And it's basically the story of a rather bilious group of Nazi types who are hanging out now, hoping for a return to Germany if in fact the Hitler regime of some kind can be restored. So you have to put up with that when and if you go to Buenos Aires, you see this all the time. For instance, Evita Perón is buried in a monumental grave. It's very much like, if you've not taken it when they haven't opened again, you should go to the nearby cemetery here. In a European tradition, they are monumental graves. They're not little gravestones. And the one for the Italian family that made chocolate famous, the Ghirardellis, is a huge grave. By a huge grave, I mean it's monumental in size. It's marble, it's a story tall, it's carved, it's quite lovely. In fact, the Ghirardellis are so famous because they didn't like the bishop and he had done them wrong. So they snuck over to that graveyard, which is very near us in Piedmont Gardens, and dug up their mother and reburied her somewhere else because they didn't like the bishop and they didn't like the church at that time. So you find all different kinds of things. But when you go to Buenos Aires, there is this enormous graveyard. And it's full of that kind of, not just a statue here and a statue here, but a building as large as a small cabin. And that's the famous burial place of Evita Perón. So the Peronists were here. Franklin Roosevelt, as president, had nothing to do with them. He had nothing but dislike for them, but he just told his Secretary of State at the time to take care of that and take care of all of South America. He wasn't interested. So basically what the Americans did was put the word out very clearly. We know where you are. We know where we can get you. So don't have anything to do with the Hitler regime across the ocean. And they didn't have much to do with it. The Germans were there already en masse, and they were citizens of Argentina. And one pocket battleship did come into the Rio Puerto River, but it went across the river to the other side, which is Montevideo, in the capital of Uruguay. And that battleship, it was a pocket battleship, the Graf Spee, was found by the British Navy and was forced to take asylum. And it remained for a very long time as a monument in Montevideo to the Nazi influence in that part of the world. But the story came to an end because we won the war. They lost the war. There was one person in particular that Israel was very interested in. You know something about Israel and its foundation in 1948? Was the search for former Nazis of high rank who had fled, and they had all fled in large measure to South America and to large measure to Argentina and some measure to Brazil. And so the most famous character there was a man named Adolf Eichmann. And the capture of Eichmann was also quite famous in that the Israelis trailed him to his location, captured him, flew him out illegally, all the way back to Israel and gave him a trial. And he was found guilty. Now, the Israelis have two standards for this. They don't believe in the death penalty, neither do I, but that's more important that they don't. But in this particular case, they decided they did. So they executed Eichmann, cremated him, and threw his ashes into the sea. All this was told to us in a very long New Yorker article. It was written by a very famous woman, Jewish herself, Hannah Arendt, and it's called Eichmann in Jerusalem. And she, like many other people who are Jewish, excited in a very negative way the Jewish imagination. But she referred to Eichmann as a case of benign neglect. Excuse me, not benign neglect. That's Mr. Nixon. She referred to him, it has to do with evil. Do you remember that? Well, it's a very famous quote. And it made the New York Jewish community in particular very, very angry because they didn't see anything like that in the way she described it. But Hannah Arendt was a very famous Jewess, German, and she'd had a love affair very early in her life for the leading philosopher who was a Nazi. So to say that it was a complex relationship and a complex connection to the South American scene only led to more, because Perón initially didn't disappear with the Nazis. He stayed in power, and then his wife came to power. And so we were left with this sort of dreadful couple, and everyone was walking around singing "Don't Cry for Me, Argentina," which was a song by Lloyd Webber from his musical in London. So it made for people who had a confused position to take on the Perón. But in Washington, it became quite clear that they were not wanted and that the United States would have little to do with them. But it's a very wonderful country, and so in many ways, it was easy for them to survive even without our support. So when they were finally gone, and then we installed a military governor there and a military dictatorship and put one in Brazil, then we had the ABC countries under the Nixon years as military dictatorships. Now those were all overthrown finally. In fact, in Chile, even though Allende was murdered, and Pinochet had come to power, he had been thrown out. And a woman became president of Chile. And she was quite wonderful and quite highly praised by other leaders. So the process was one of rapid change in a way that kept these people constantly worried that they would be somehow interfered with by the Americans. Cordell Hull tried to assume the leadership of this American effort to pacify the feelings. Not only did we have this Alliance for Progress, we had a Pan-American highway we were going to build. It's never been built. It got stuck somewhere in Central America. So almost all of our attempts to deal with them ran into either financial questions like Anaconda Copper and what to do about it as a major American corporation struggling down and making a great fortune for copper mining, or even more towards the center would be United Fruit, which of course was the only way I can describe it to you is that it was a fiercely competitive group, and it was organized by the Americans. And when we finally found that we had such a bad reputation, what they decided to do in America was to change the name of the company and allow it to go on misbehaving. So let me explain it to you in another way. Hollywood made lots of movies that dealt with this part of the world. Hollywood was immersed in the idea of a Latin lover. So we had people like Fernando Lamas, who became one of Lana Turner's ex, and Ricardo Montalban, all playing the role of a Latin lover in films that required someone to fly down to Rio, as they say in the movies. And we not only have that, but MGM was such a big studio, it had people for every little occasion. So there was a woman at the backlot at Metro who could wear more fruit in her head, on our top of her head, than any had ever seen. Her name was Carmen Miranda. And she appeared in these movies with 5 or 6 bananas, 8 or 9 oranges, 2 or 3, whatever, all stuck in this huge headdress that she wore. And she would appear in films. She was the ghost, very much like Lena Horne was. Lena Horne was a great star, but she was an African-American star. So Metro would open a scene and Lena Horne would come out and she'd sing Stormy Weather. And then she'd disappear because it wasn't possible to have her appear with a white man. And so she just wouldn't appear with anybody. She'd sing and go. And Carmen Miranda would run around with her bananas, and then she'd go. And Metro was full of people like that. You could have a whole movie built around Esther Williams who swam for 2 hours. And with other women swimming, that was the movie. And another time you could go to see ice skating, and there was Sonia Henning, and all she did was skate. And so this was a phenomenon of America in the 50s and 60s. And these film stars had an only special place to be, and then they disappeared. And it went on that way as they tried to capture the myth of the Latin lover, whether it's Ricardo Montalban or even with I Love Lucy. There was Jesse Arnaz, again, another case of the Latin lover being used in a comedy situation on television. So what to make of all of that and to make it into a political statement about Latin? It has been dispossessed in many cases of its will. It has fabulous things to see. If you go down to Argentina after you have enjoyed very much the opera house there, which is as big as La Scala, you can go to the north. And when you finally come to the north, you'll come to a border with Montevideo, with Uruguay and Brazil. And there is this monumental waterfall, Iguazu. which has borders on all three countries and is a sight to be seen. It's twice as big and large as Niagara Falls is. It reminds me basically of Victoria Falls in Africa. Iguazu is a major attraction for people going north to overlook the land, because the land of Argentina is also famous for its pampas. The pampas is a huge grassland. And in that grassland, it's huge amounts of beef are raised, beef cattle. And so Argentina is one of the great producers of livestock and then the slaughtering of and the shipment of. In fact, Britain gets most of its beef from Argentina. In fact, during the heyday of relations with South America, since Americans believed that the Monroe Doctrine was actually working, and everyone knew it wasn't working, the thing that made it work was that the British fleet kept everybody else away from South America. And the British themselves went in and bought up much of it. For instance, the British built and then paid for and ran the Argentine Railroad. They only sold it finally in World War I to pay off some of the World War I debt that they had incurred. So besides rail and beef, all this process locked itself together in an international relationship. And if you go and you can see it on either side, you'll find also that unfortunately they've discovered oil. And the oil has been discovered in a huge basin that's offshore. So the Brazilian government today is a very wealthy government, very much like the North Sea countries of Norway, and even a slice of Britain and Scotland, and some of the Netherlands, all with the North Sea oil, which has all been found under the North Sea. And it's pumped up to these big basins and then shipped around to various places in Europe that can use it. So now off of Brazil itself, you'll see when you go out, if you ever go there, huge oil derricks in the sea, and they are bringing the oil up from the surface, from this underneath, and bringing it to the platforms on the top, and then moved by ship. So Brazil has become an oil giant, just the way that Chile is a copper giant, and just the way that Argentina is a beef and livestock giant for many parts of the world. And now, of course, the outcome of all of this has been the Chinese have seen this as a very rich area that they can involve themselves in. So the People's Republic of China, with its capital in Beijing, has made huge, enormous loans to these countries in hopes of being able to influence them in their flow. And particularly is the oil from Brazil. It's very hard to get to China from Brazil because there's something called the tip of South America. And the straits there are very dangerous. And so the Chinese are paying for a huge highway that will go across Brazil, across the high mountains of the Atlas, and then over into the other side, which is Chile, and then will offload or onload and go across the sea and offload in China. So you have these Chinese investments which frustrate us tremendously. The problem is we don't need the oil ourselves. The Chinese are desperate for it, and the Chinese are willing to pay a fortune for it, and also infrastructure, which otherwise would not allow the oil to be moved from South America to Asia. So all these kinds of involved processes have made the Americans very nervous about our backyard as we see it, being now very much involved with the Chinese. Not only that, the Brazilians and the Argentines were very interested in a whole system of airline routes. And they paid for a tremendous effort. You might remember it was the most beautiful airplane ever designed. it was the Concorde. And it was particularly useful for Argentinians and Brazilians to think about flying either from Buenos Aires or from Rio directly to London and directly to Paris. Unfortunately, it was one of those Airbus that went down halfway between Brazil and Europe. It's never really been found. It's a very deep area that it went down in. But it led to a tragic set of circumstances, which the Concorde was finally not in use anymore. The problem with it was it never made money. And corporations do not like to be involved in things that don't make money. So it's been replaced by a huge Airbus, which now services South America. But none of it flies as fast and as far as the Concorde flew in its heyday. So what more can I tell you about the Central American, rather the South American view? They have the highest mountains, the Andes, and in that part of the world, they have, there's always a joke at Berkeley. A Yale guy who was an archaeologist went and announced to the world in the 1920s that he had discovered Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu is a Inca ruin, and it's easy enough to get to. First you fly to Lima, then you fly up on a smaller plane to Cuzco, the ancient Inca city, still lived in. You amaze yourself when you see the fact that huge pieces of stone were perfectly cut by the Incas and placed in areas where they would then build a habitat. And Cuzco is a very beautiful city. But then you have to get from Cuzco up even higher to Machu Picchu. You can do it by several ways. There's a very unfashionable but slow-moving choo-choo train that will carry you to the top. Or there is also the Inca Trail, which you can walk. And I walked it when I was much younger, and you need to do what the Incas did. The Incas had a little leaf that they chewed on all the time. And the leaf, of course, is cocaine. And that will give you lots of energy as you make your way up to the top of Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu was deserted, but it had never been discovered per se. The Incas, or the former Incas, the people who lived in the area, knew exactly where it was. They themselves went to it many times. But Yale took what it could away from the site, and it's only most recently that Yale had the courage to return the items that they had taken from Machu Picchu to the people of Peru. And they are now on display so that you can see them and you can go there. It's not an easy trip, but it's really breathtaking to be so high in those very high mountains. And I get the feeling of what the Inca Empire must have been like at its heyday. It, of course, ended with the Spanish invasion. Atahualpa was their last Inca ruler. He was murdered by the Spanish Inquisition. There are lots of reasons why South Americans don't like lots of people, because that's part of their heritage. The Inca heritage, people who built these great cities, great monuments, and who still live there. Lima is a very livable city. It's very cool. It's not overwhelmingly hot. And the Peruvians have gotten their revenge on us, I guess you'd call it. The Peruvians recognize that when you have your winter in Chicago or Milwaukee or Boston, choose a city. It's cold. Nothing's growing. But that's the summertime in Peru. There was a very famous heart surgeon who did the first heart operations, transposing one heart to another body and the body living. And he bought the first of these farms outside of Lima for miles and miles it stretches, because everyone's got into this business. So in January, they will send a 747 loaded with lettuce that will sell for $5, $7, whatever market will bear, to Chicago. And some of you might have done that before, bought things you didn't know where they came from. In fact, much of this fresh produce comes by 747 to airports near your hometown and is offloaded and then sold. And it's a very profitable business, whether it's in my famous blueberries that I like to have for breakfast every morning. And blueberries do not grow in California in January, but they grow in Lima and in all the other places around Lima. So these various connective links between the South American economy and ours have been profitable both sides. Those who plant and grow, those who harvest, and those who ship and sell. It's a huge international trade, and it also works elsewhere. Usually elsewhere means that the French have cornered the market. For instance, when the common market was signed as a deal in Europe, the French saw to it that all the former French colonies were included. So I don't know if you know it, but Algeria grows a lot of oranges, and they don't grow oranges in Denmark, and they don't grow oranges in Norway. And so therefore, these crops are allowed to live and grow in these areas with entry-free, duty-free. They even made a deal finally with Israel, so that the Israelis, who also grow a great deal of citrus fruit, can bring their produce across international borders without paying any heavy duties, given the very basic rules that were established by the common market for former colonies or special deals with certain countries. So South America has garnered some of that to their side. They also have a huge tourist trade, because people like to go there. They like to go up and see the splendor of Iguazu Falls. There's also a set of falls that is spectacular in the north, in Venezuela. So it's just not in one place that you can see these incredible, beautiful sights, but in many others. And the Venezuelans also are very much involved in oil and gas. And American companies have gone there. You can see them also offshore, drilling very near to the coast, bringing their natural gas or their oil to tankers waiting to offload or to unload and bring things up to North America. What the North Americans refer to as El Norte, which the South Americans refer to as El Norte. And so it's a trade that has been worthwhile for both sides, when in fact it's not exploited. The exploitive trade was trade by United Fruit and trade by Anaconda, both which have been taken away by natural processes of taking and nationalizing these and making them local.
How do you do?
The system says
Oh, wait a second, let me, if you, this is,
and operating in your
Oh,
country.
here's Bonnie.
what?
That's your memo.
Am I listening to somebody?
And it says,
Proverbial cell phone. So I think we're going to try now and see if there might be a question or two by somebody who would like to know something more, whether it's Venezuela or Colombia, two states in North and South America that have much to do with us, or has to do with the ABC countries, Argentina, Brazil, or Chile, or the smaller countries like Paraguay, Uruguay. I have a friend, Jean-Francois, who was a cowboy once. A Frenchman as a cowboy is almost an oxymoron, but he worked as a cowboy down in South America and loved it. Rode off across the plains after the cows. So, anyone with a question? No one knows or has any question to do with South America? Yes.
I just want to make a comment about Lima. When I was in Lima, I saw such abject wealth and abject poverty very close to each other, and it was very startling, and I've never seen anything that diverse where in any of the travels I've gone to. And I was wondering if you want to address yourself to the reasons for that existence.
Yes, it is very true that if you go to Lima, you'll see great wealth and great poverty, nothing in the middle.
Nothing in the middle, right?
And the process is one of trying to change that. Now, various people have worked at it, obviously. If you're going to have a middle class, you have to have middle class jobs, you have to have people trained. Supposedly, our Alliance for Progress is going to help do that. The United Nations has several projects at work. It takes a large amount of energy and time to create a middle class. You have to have all the workings for the education system to educate a middle class. And you have to have a group that will invest money so that the jobs are there once they are trained. And that has always been a problem in countries, particularly like Peru, which has this famous past of the Incas, but an infamous present of poverty. Alan?
First of all, the phrase that Hannah Arendt used about Eichmann was the banality of evil.
That's right. Thank you very much. Not benign neglect, the banality of evil. And she's been shot down for that for years because lots of people were very unhappy with it, particularly people in the New Yorker who published it. Go ahead.
The question I have is whether you can address the socialist leaders in Venezuela and Bolivia and other northern South American countries that have created so much poverty in those countries.
Alan is referring to two very famous cases in which we have been less than friendly and hospitable, actually, towards these leaders. And they have been, in return, insulting towards us. How to say what to do. Part of the problem is spending away from, we can extend that far. People in Central and South America always admired Fidel Castro. People in the United States were taught to not admire Fidel Castro. So immediately, you have a South American country that comes to the rescue of Cuba when Soviet oil no longer flows, because as you know, the Soviet Union imploded. And so this South American country gave a great amount of oil and gas to Cuba. In return, Cuba, which amazingly, you should pay close attention, trained thousands of nurses and thousands of doctors because they revolutionized their own. You know, Cuba has a fantastic education system. When Castro came to power, less than 10% of the population was literate. Today, 100% is literate and numerate. I've been to those schools, they're incredible. Up in the mountains of Cuba, you'll find a little school working. In the same case, in every little village we went to where we wanted to ask questions, they showed us the local doctor's office. Where before there was no medicine. Now there is medicine, not only for everybody, not only are the nurses trained, and do they go to every village? Yes, to every village is visited by a doctor and a nurse. They don't live in every village, but they go to every village. And in that kind of process, they then exported their medical technology. So that in Venezuela, which was giving them oil and gas, Castro gave them medical teams, huge numbers of doctors and nurses, not just 2, not just 5, not just 50, but hundreds have gone abroad. And this has built up talk about a period of good feeling. Everyone that I know, from Mexico to Costa Rica, to Argentina, to Brazil, feels it's a badge of honor to have done the one trip of a lifetime to Cuba. So what you can use, there's just no feeling of disrespect at all for this effort. It's been very positive, and it's gained the Cubans a great deal of influence in the world. So they fought poverty their own way. And they have been reciprocated. You know, one of the great leaders of Cuba's revolution was an Argentine. Maybe you read the Diary of Che Guevara, the Motorcycle Diary of Che Guevara. It's a wonderful book. And Che Guevara was a son of a doctor. And he came to Mexico, looking around, and there in Mexico, he met the young Fidel. And when Fidel carried out his revolution, Che went with him. You know, the only thing that reminds me of Che Guevara today is we paid the group in Bolivia that captured him. And to make sure we got the right person, we had them cut off Che Guevara's hands. And the rumor is that the hands of Che Guevara are now in a vault in CIA headquarters outside of Washington. That's just about as bad as knowing that the jaw of Adolf Hitler is somewhere in the Kremlin. So what can I tell you? It's a convoluted story and not a happy one for Americans, in many cases, a tragic one. And the difficulty of changing the nature that, for instance, you pick up the Chronicle today and it says, Biden is in trouble because they are all ganging up at the Texas border, all these immigrants. Well, why do you think Hondurans and Guatemalans want to come here? They're escaping mass poverty. And so the way to perhaps at least tamp down this is to have I know all of you are too young to remember, but there once was a Marshall Plan for Europe. When Europe was in ruin, Germany was a rubble pile. I went to Germany when it was recovering. It was a sad sight. Today it's a marvelous sight. Well, we should have a Marshall Plan for those smaller states that over time, and it will take time, because it took time for, we had a Marshall Plan, we met together. Well, where would Americans want to meet? In Paris, of course. So we came to Paris, we came to a building that had been owned by a very famous minister, Louis XIV. It's a palace complex that's right on the Place de la Concorde. Why not? And we met there and we said, just tell us what you want. We don't know what you want. We don't know what you need. You make a list and we will give them to you. And don't think small. If you need a motor company, ask for the world. Ask for all the engine parts that you need, the machine tools that you need, everything, so that we can ship you one from North America to Europe. And so the great companies of Europe rose back out of, look, I lived in the motor capital of Germany, Stuttgart. What was near to Stuttgart? Sindelfingen. What was in Sindelfingen? Volkswagen. Not far away was Mercedes. The only company that wasn't there was BMW because it's called Bavarian Motor Works and it's not allowed to be outside of Bavaria. So it was in Augsburg. But they all got their start the way that these people, the great treasure in Europe was they had human capital already trained, already educated. All you had to do was give them the tools to rebuild them. In the case of Central America, there is no educated base in large measure. And what there is there are people who generally spend most of their time in Paris. The very, very rich of Central America and South America have homes elsewhere. So it's a difficult question at best, but it's not impossible. And particularly for Mr. Biden, who doesn't know what to do because we are being overwhelmed at the border. And the children are there and they're without sometimes their parents and things. And how we could lose all those children during the Trump years, as dumb as that man was. We lost children. It's a crime. Well, I preached to you long enough. Did I see another hand before we? Yes, in the back. Yes, sir, in the back.
I have two questions.
Answer, talk to the machine.
I have a question. You mentioned the movie Notorious. Was that based on a book?
I don't know that Hitchcock got that. It was, of course, a very famous Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman
Yes.
film. So I wouldn't want to risk my reputation that I said it was, and it did turn out to be.
Your reputation is wonderful. I have another question. Costa Rica, that seems to be a pretty stable, prosperous country in the midst of a lot of poverty.
Yes,
A reason.
it was settled, frankly. Of course, they were all settled by, in a sense, Spaniards, but not in large measure. The people who came to Costa Rica were German farmers. And they run a very prosperous farm system there. And when you're there, you think, my word, I must be somewhere near maybe Nuremberg or Augsburg. It's a wonderful country. Small farms, prosperous, an educated class of people. Their president has won a Nobel Prize for peace. I can't say enough, and it's just night and day. Costa Rica is the day. Panama, Guatemala is the night. And yet they're near each other. So it takes human capital. And the Germans brought that human capital to work with them when they came to Costa Rica. And they made it work. And they reinvested in it. So that they have universities there. They have schools. They have their churches. They have a system of government that is good and works for the good of the people. What more can you add? We didn't get that for many years here. Remember the last 5 or 6 years under that idiot? Any other questions? Well, I think we've done enough preaching for the day. I'll see you next week if you come. Thank you very much. Have a nice week. We'll soon be eating back again in the dining room.